I'm sorry, I'm really sorry I'm so late. John must have locked the door, did he? Yeah, I'll tell you a story. When I was on the GLC, I was doing a meeting in Hackney with Ken Livingstone, and we hadn't turned up. And they said, keep on talking, keep on talking. And I did half an hour, 45 minutes. I said, where the hell is he? They said, just keep talking. He's in Luton. There was a bloke on the front row, not just fell asleep, but was snoring profoundly. I think someone passed away in the back of the hall. Anyway, they were bored stiff with me. Livingstone comes in, he speaks for 3 minutes, does a standing ovation and walks. I could have killed him. You know? Typical. This morning, the reason I'm late is because this morning I had a breakfast meeting in London, and then I had to go up to Preston to meet a whole group of Labour councillors and others dealing with the issues that we're facing in Barnet as well. So I want you to know what we're talking about now in terms of where we go forward in terms of the policies. It's interesting you're holding this meeting this week because you'll have read the papers. Local government right around the country now is in crisis. Northamptonshire, Tory-controlled Northampton, saying that, well, virtually bankrupt. Ironically, Surrey, where Philip Hammond, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, is an MP, today that was exposed that they've got a deficit of something like 100 million. And this is after, we're into the 8th year of austerity. And what I said in today, it's in the media, basically, what the Tory government has done is they've used councils to impose the cuts that central government are demanding. But they've gone beyond that. You know what Barnet's like. Barnet, well, they're something special, aren't they? They've gone well beyond anything asked of them. They've been into deep cuts, but also they're obsessed, you know as well as I do, they're obsessed with privatisation. Absolutely obsessed with it. The Easy Council, Easy Council concept was all about privatisation, selling off, and then allowing the private sector to make profits out of how? Their concepts, the expression is sweating the assets. That means undermining working conditions and cutting pay and cutting staff. And that's happened right the way across the piece in Barnet. And it's interesting, councils like mine, Hillingdon Tory Council like mine, have looked to Barnet as an example to emulate in their own areas. So we've been getting it as well. And it's appalling. It's appalling what's been happening, quite honestly. I'll just give you one example of just how rough it is in my constituency. I represent Hayes and Harlington. I've lived there 40 years. Hayes, it's a working class, multicultural community like this, basically. Last Friday, we're trying to get housing for a young woman with mental health problems, expecting a baby any minute, living in a shed rented out to her. Hillingdon Tory Council initially refused to house her on the basis she's not homeless. We have to get the planning officer down to take action against the landlord, and only then will they accept her as homeless. And then what happens, it's like here, she's now going to bed and breakfast. You only get on the waiting list in my patch if you've been living there 10 years. And then you're lucky after 8 years if you get a house or property. And I know what will happen with that young woman. Well, I know because the midwives have said, when you have this baby, you can't come out into those conditions again. You can't allow a child to do that. So again, we'll be back around that same old circle, exactly as here, putting pressure on the council to house someone who desperately needs a roof over their heads. And why is it all caused? It's all caused that we need to understand, and as trade union members, we've got to explain to people out there what this is all about. And we've got to, I don't mean patronise, and I think we've got to raise the level of debate. And we can do it as a union, basically. We've got to explain to people what neoliberalism is all about. We should use their language as well, by the way. Neoliberalism is this economic theory that it's always better for the private sector to deliver a service rather than the public sector. You cut the taxes for the rich and the corporations, and somehow this will trickle down. At the same time, you privatise the public services, but at the same time, you undermine trade union rights. And on that basis, that's how they make their profits. The result of that ideology of neoliberalism is what we're getting today. Council after council collapsing in terms of deliver their public services. It's what has caused the crisis in the NHS. It's caused what's happening in schools at the moment. where teachers, not just been threatened with pay, but we've lost classroom assistants, caretakers and all the rest. The first cuts per capita in terms of pupils since the 1970s and 1980s, happening right the way across in every public service. We're just having probation collapse as well at the moment. And prisons more dangerous than we've seen maybe in generations. And it's all because of this ideology that competition is always best, that the private sector can always do it better than the public sector, that we cut people's taxes and somehow that will better off everybody. Well, now we know the results of all that, and now I think people are waking up to it as well. That's why in the last general election, when we put the Labour manifesto out there, it said very, very clearly, we're going to end austerity. We're now an anti-austerity party. There will be no austerity under Labour. Why? Because it's unnecessary. At the end of the day, it's counterproductive as well. And when we put that manifesto out there, it was amazing, really. It was amazing, because when people started reading it, know what we were all about, we shot up in the opinion polls. We got balanced coverage in the media. Legally, we had to. And they could see what we were all about. Do you know, I think if the general election campaign had gone on another couple of weeks, we'd be in government at the moment. I think we would. But that election is now over. That manifesto was for that election. We're now drafting up the new manifesto based upon, the basic policies with that manifesto itself. And it's just straightforward, step by step. We end austerity. How do we therefore ensure that we have the resources to pay for our public services? It's simple. I met with the London Chamber of Commerce this morning, and there was a whole range of business leaders, etc. And I had to be straight with them. The way we're going to end austerity and pay for our public services, we are going to increase the taxes on the top richest 5% in the country. We're going to reverse the corporation tax cuts that the government has given to the big corporations, because actually they've given the tax cuts, but they're not investing it in jobs, etc. And in addition to that, and I have to be straight with people, in addition to that, if you're trying to evade or avoid your tax and you're shoving your money into a tax haven, we're coming for you. Because we want you to pay your taxes. Why should we go to work, pay our taxes through the PAYE system, others then launder their money into tax havens and avoid their responsibilities? And it's interesting, a lot of the private finance initiative companies have sold on their shares from the contracts, and a lot of that has gone to tax havens. So you have this bizarre thing where they're using our taxes to pay private companies to provide the services, which they don't do particularly effectively, and they make the profits that then go into a tax haven and they don't pay taxes on it. I don't know what you call that. That's scandalous, isn't it? Absolutely scandalous. So what we said, we'll have a fair taxation system. We'll top the top 5% paying more. We'll end tax evasion and tax avoidance. We'll make sure that we reverse the corporation tax cuts. And what we'll then do is we'll start investing. And I've been doing meetings like this all around the country, literally for the last few years with Jeremy. And we've been saying to people, what should we do? What do you need? And we had health workers turning up, and they said, well, as simple as this. Yeah, we want a proper pay. We want to end the pay cap, of course we do. But it's interesting, when people have been saying that, nurses, doctors, ancillary workers, they've also said, yeah, that's important to us, but we want you to fund the service that we provide. We want to have respect for our service and support for it. And also what we want you to do is end the privatisation where you're pouring money in one door, and through the back door it's going into the coffers of Virgin and all the other profiteers. So they said that's what we'll do. We'll end the privatisation of the NHS. Full stop. That's what we'll do. Other people turned up, and a lot of teachers turned up, said exactly the same thing. What's happening to us? We're under so much pressure. We're teaching to the test all the time. Our schools have now become academies. They've become big business. It's the first stage of privatisation. So we said we want to bring education back under local democratic control. We want to fund education properly. And at the same time, we want to give those people who deliver the services at the front line the respect that they deserve. They should be the people who are planning our services, the ones who deliver it at the front line. And we said the same with local government. At the moment, what's happening, what the government's plan is that they withdraw all central government grant, and eventually all that councils will be able to raise is through business rates. Well, that's fine if you're in Kensington and Chelsea or somewhere where there's high levels of income from businesses, etc. But in other areas, particularly in areas out of London and outside of London, there isn't that business rate base there to happen. So what we've said, we're going to review local government finance, but in the budget I put forward in the election, we put £2 billion immediately back into local government to start paying for the services again. And I'll tell you what, before the last budget, before Christmas, I'm trying not to get angry on these things. I'm on the Jeremy Corbyn niceness course. I get halfway and I get sent back to square one. That's the problem. I got really angry at Philip Hamm before the budget because we had a report prepared for us, sent in by local government association and by a number of charities working with children. And it basically said that in terms of the number of children coming to care now is shot up, is at record levels. The number of interventions in terms of children put on risk registers is at record levels as well. And the reason so many children are coming to care is because the cuts in children's services has been that early interventions are now so rare. And what that happens, if you don't assist the family when they're first having a problem, the problem develops, and then eventually, and it's a false saving as well, because it's more costly to bring the child into care. The local authorities and the charities, one of the charities said this, Action for Children said this, they said this is, if we don't get some more resources, this crisis could turn into a catastrophe, the number of vulnerable children that there are out there. 2 billion was put there, we asked for it, and they refused it. But what angered me most of all is at the same time he's refusing to put money into children's services, they cut the levy on the bankers. And that levy was introduced after the bank crash in 2007, 2008. And it was almost like a fine on the banks to say, you've got to pay your way now to help us out of this crisis. He cut the levy on the bankers. So he's not willing to give money for vulnerable children, but he's quite willing to give cuts in their taxes to the banks themselves. I thought that was outrageous. And it goes on like that, every public service. We've met with police officers this week, and again what's happening is there are 20,000 police jobs gone. 20,000 police officer jobs gone. No wonder people have begun to feel unsafe. Theresa May says, well, crime is going down. Violent crime isn't going down. In London, I'm terrified when my son goes out at night. I'm worried stiff that he's not going to suffer some of what our children have suffered, which is the knife crimes, etc. All of those services have been cut whilst they've given away tax cuts to the rich and the corporations, and whilst they've done very little about, well, tax evasion and tax avoidance. So we've said when we go back into government, we'll have a fair taxation system, we'll invest in our economy to grow our economy, of course we will, infrastructure, skills and new technology, and make sure research and development happens. That's what's happening right the way across Europe with our other economic competitors. We'll make sure we grow the economy. But what we'll make sure we do is we invest in our public services. And that's the ambition that we have. That's the ambition that we have. And this is not rocket science. This is completely rational. And that's why I think we've got so much support when we get our message across. It's difficult with the media to get the message across because they're not interested in, well, in some instances, they're not interested in allowing us to get that message across. But when we do, I think we pick up support. And what we're doing now to affect that is we're using every mechanism we can. We've reinvented word of mouth as a form of political communication. Meetings like this are taking place all over the country. And when Jeremy Corbyn turns up, there's hundreds, thousands of people at home. We're using social media. We're using every possible mechanism we can to get our message across. That's why I think we may well soon be in government. I think this government will collapse. I never underestimate the Tories' ability to cling on to office. They're not in power. Literally, I don't know who's in power from one day to the next because the cabinet is squabbling all the time. You don't know it's Boris Johnson, Liam Fox, Philip Hammond, Theresa May, or whatever, because you never know what coalition has gone on. Nothing's happening in Parliament at the moment apart from Brexit. Other legislation is barely going through because Theresa May can't get a majority in her own cabinet, can't get the support of half her backbenchers, and every decision that comes through has to be vetoed by the DWP. So it's a right paralysis in government at the moment. So I think they'll cling on for as long as they possibly can, but what we'll seek to do is to basically argue our case, get our policies across, and prepare for government, prepare to implement the policies that we want to see to transform our society. And when that general election comes, the one thing that we've got, and they haven't, is we've got a mass movement now. We've got 600,000 Labour Party members, the biggest political party in Western Europe. We have trade unions now growing again in numbers, arguing our case, demonstrating what we're doing. And that's one of the key issues that we put forward as well. When we go back into government, what's the best way of protecting people's wages? Join a trade union. So we want to bring back a real living wage, £10 an hour, but we want that protected by the restoration of trade union rights in this country. And we're not asking for the earth, we're asking simply for future governments to abide by the International Labour Organisation conventions. Just keep to the law, that's all we're asking for future governments. And it means on trade unions, we'll scrap the Trade Union Act in the first 100 days of a Labour government. We'll get rid of it, basically. But we've said we'll bring forward now a Ministry of Labour which will regulate and make sure there's inspections so people get paid a proper wage, but we'll restore free collective bargaining on a sectoral basis. And in local government, that means scrapping the pay cap, letting our union negotiate on our behalf a decent pay settlement, and we'll pay for that, as I say, out of a fair taxation system. That's where we're at. This is an extremely exciting period at the moment, no matter how difficult it is. We know what's happening in terms of the pressure that's on local communities. We know what's happening, particularly the pressure on public sector workers, whether it's local government, NHS, education, or wherever. But actually, for the first time in quite a while now, there's light at the end of the tunnel. I used to say that, and they said, well, it's not, you just get accustomed to the dark. No more. I will not get accustomed to the dark. There's light at the end of the tunnel, and that light at the end of the tunnel is a Labour government, but it's a Labour government under Jeremy Corbyn. And I say it time and time again, we need to explain to people the society we want to create. It's one that's radically fairer, radically more equal, radically more democratic. But it's going to be based upon a prosperous economy that's economically and environmentally sustainable. But here's the difference. That prosperity is going to be shared by everybody. I call that a word that was not used for a period, socialism.
There were two things that I think were similar to what happened in Carillion. One, last week, the very week that Capita plunged into this crisis, the Tories awarded them a £43 million contract. Yeah. And then last night, what I absolutely could not believe, the Local Government Association, in effect, were advising councillors to look after Capita's business for fear that it may lead to services coming back in-house. Would you be able to comment on that, yeah?
Look, we've made it clear. Jeremy Corbyn made a fairly strong speech a couple of weeks ago where he said, look, the issue for us is we're opposed to outsourcing, full stop. We're opposed to outsourcing. He said from here on in, local government, other services, NHS or whatever, the preference should always be to deliver in-house. That's the preference. We've also said we now start the process of bringing PFIs and outsourcing back in-house. Okay? Now, there's been a lot of opposition to that, but that was before Carillion happened, actually, before Carillion hit the fan. And before Capita, I'm glad you're checking my shares, that's really good of you. Joke, all right, joke. I published my income tax returns, and there was 15 quid income from last year, and it said from a dividend, and the bloody Tory press went mad. I said, it's a dividend from the credit union that I set up in my constituency. Anyway, what happened in Carillion is a good example of just how privatisation, one, is not just doesn't deliver the service effectively, is more costly, because some of the costs that the National Audit Office have said are between 40 or 70% higher than if it had been provided by the state and it kept in the public sector, but also how unstable it is, just how unstable it is. It isn't just Capita, it's other companies as well. So what we're saying, they should be brought back in-house, and that should be always the preference, direct service delivery. Now, that doesn't mean to say that the local councils won't do anything. Well, I was chair of finance on the GRC. We built the Thames Barrier. I raised the money in the city. We built the Thames Barrier, but it was a public-owned asset. Yes, we had private builders and others and direct labour working together on that site. I don't mind that. But we managed it and owned it, and we never got exploited as a result of that. That's why we're just saying time and time again, you compare what the private sector has done to the public sector, you will always get a better deal in the public sector. Why? Because in the public sector, you're not paying dividends to your shareholders. You're not having to cream off a profit to enable that to happen. And if you look at what happened on Carillion, which is a scandal, and I was on picket lines against Carillion because they're a blacklisting company as well. Royston Bentham up in Liverpool, one of our members, one of our activists, blacklisted for 8 years, but as a result of being health and safety rep on a Carillion site. What happened there is that they were paying out dividends higher than their profits. How do you work that one out then? So they were sucking money out of there. And if you look at what they were doing as well, and this is where we'll change the law too, they were paying out dividends whilst their pension fund deficit was increasing year on year. Now we could solve that. You could simply introduce legislation, say you don't pay dividends unless you've got a strategy that properly manages your pension fund. And issues like that will be legislation when we go back in. On the LGA, we weren't aware of what the LGA put out, and they were saying don't do anything that destabilises the contracts, etc. And I don't know whether that was a precautionary measure, they might have heard something or whatever, but what we've been saying consistently, please have that public sector preference in your mind when you're delivering a service. This is going to take years to unravel some of this outsourcing, some of the PFIs, but in the long run it'll be worth it. One final point on it. There was a public-private partnership on London Underground, okay? It was collapsed, it was brought back in-house. National Audit Office, you look at the figures, they say 470 million on that. 470 million. A lot of that was savings, not just from stopping dividends and profits going to the profiteering companies, it was also the legal costs, the management consultancy costs and all those. You've seen it here. Sometimes these contracts have more management consultants than there are workers delivering the service, you know? That's it.
Talked about the need to invest in public services, and we know we desperately need that in local government. We know the cuts, in particular since 2010, have had a horrific impact on local services. And we've now got a situation where we've got local elections coming up. We've got Labour councils, unfortunately, that have lowered their sights in terms of, and their horizons in terms of what they think that they can achieve, what they're willing to promise. I suppose what I'm asking is, what do we need in terms of, I mean, it's great what you've said in terms of what a Labour government would do. What do we need in terms of a campaign for more funding for local government, for local government services? What can the Labour leadership do on this as well?
There's two things in a campaign, isn't there? First is to expose what's happened. And I think in any campaign that we do now has got to be really ruthless in exposing what's happened over the last 8 years, because the media haven't really reported it. The way in which people understand what's going on is that, well, it's the local council making cuts, not knowing the role of central government in particular, what they've been doing over the years. We've got to expose that. Actually, this branch has done a good job of that in the campaigns over the years, to be honest, from what I've seen. And you've done it creatively as well. Doing the Russell Brand film was amazing. So that's been quite creative. You've involved yourselves with community. So I think expose what's going on, and then start explaining to people there is a solution. And the solution is a Labour council and a Labour government. And the way that we do that is be creative as well before a Labour government arrives. I was up in Preston today because they've done what they call, we've been working on it for 2 years, the Collaborative Council. What they've done is they've now linked up themselves, the NHS, the local university and the police service. They've come together and said, right, our public procurement, where we buy services, we're going to buy them in this town and in this area. So the money that's flying out to big companies and all the rest of it, we now reinvest, we deliver our services in a direct model as best we can, but if we have to commission outside, it goes to local companies in this area to create jobs, and also they're developing cooperatives on a scale I've not seen before. They reckon now they've brought £200 million back into the area, 1,600 jobs. Creativity like that as well. So what I've done today in Preston is said we're going to set up this community wealth unit to advise other Labour councils that are coming to power how you can go about it as well and work together in that way. But the message has got to go out there, you know, that it's what Jeremy Corbyn said the other day, what these Tories are doing at every level, they're taking away the very foundations of our society that make it a civilised society. I think we've got to shock people to see what's going on. The fact that we've got homelessness doubling in this city, people actually dying on the streets as a result of it. You know, the cuts in terms of mental health provision have been appalling. 100,000 people in ambulances for more than half an hour because they can't get into an A&E. You know, we've never had a crisis like this since before the setting up of the NHS itself. And in terms of, you know, I just go back to education again. Our youngsters doing everything asked of them, staying on at school, getting their A-levels, going to university, and they come out with a £55,000 debt. That's just scandalous. You know, education for us is a gift from one generation to another. It's not a commodity to be bought and sold, and that's why we'll scrap tuition fees. We want health, and we want a national education service in the same way there's a national health service, so free from cradle to grave at the point of need. When we go out campaigning, in addition to exposing what the Tories have done, in addition to saying these are the creative ways we can combat some of that, we've got to give people that vision of that society that we want to create. And that will further the arrival of a Labour government to work with everyone to create that vision. That's the other point I want to make, actually. The most important thing about this movement that we've developed now is that when we go into government, it can't be just a group of MPs going off there to try and implement the manifesto as best they can. That will never work. That will never work. What we've got to do is recognise we're a social movement now. We're all going to create our ideas, pool those ideas. We're all going to be part of the implementation of those policies. So the concept is when we go into government, Labour, we all go into government. We all go. This becomes a government of us all, not some hierarchical party or whatever that we've had in the past. And what you'll be doing is here, sitting down to say, right, where do we need the housing? What sort of services do we need? What resources do we need? Demanding from central government how we get those resources and then start implementing them. So the community implements the policies, and that on that basis, they can never take it away from us again, because we'll have mobilised the community to prevent that happening.
As you know, John, I think I'm ex-revenue, Jamie Manson. The other side of other aspect of privatisation was this extraordinary belief that the private side should basically run the revenue. And I don't know how much you've been following this, John, but for example, an anti-avoidance provision was brought in. It's actually called something different, but it's an anti-avoidance to try and stop tax avoidance. Who polices that? A group of tax avoiders. Yeah. And I don't know whether people know this aspect too. So when you start tackling avoidance and evasion, I think that'll be one of the first things to look at.
Yeah. Jenny's an active campaigner, and I'm hoping she's going to put her name forward to stand in for Labour in Finchley eventually. I hope she does. Because we need people who understand the world and also can communicate and campaign in that way and have a track record of campaigning. Just so you know, we did a review of HMRC, the tax collectors, and what we found, and we got a group of, a guy called Prem Seeker, a professor of accountancy, is brilliant. You'll hear him on TV and radio occasionally. They did a review. This is a tax justice campaign Jeremy and I have been working with for helped found about 20 years ago. They did a review of HMRC with PCS, the trade union as well, and discovered, first of all, the way it is managed. They have all these consultative groups on issues around taxation, all these little forums and all this sort of thing. And then they're designing tax reliefs and things like that. And then you look at who's on them. They're all accountancy companies that are advising clients who benefit from those tax reliefs that they're developing. So we're doing a review of all tax reliefs and tax expenditures, for example. We've done a review with PCS about the staffing, because what's happened is that there have been massive cuts. There's something like 40,000 job cuts in HMRC. So no wonder the tax is not being collected. The government boasts about how much money it's collected as a result of their tax avoidance plans. Actually, most of those schedules were brought in as a result of Gordon Brownley's last year. But the tax gap the Tories admit to is £34 billion a year. Okay? Others estimate it as anything up to £120 billion a year. I'll settle for half. If we got 60 billion in, to be honest, or something like that, we'd be able to fund the NHS, education, public services, local government, etc. And that's why I get sent, thanks to Jeremy, I get sent off to Davos to meet these rich people to basically say, I'm here to tell you, please, not just please pay your taxes, you will pay your taxes. And I said also, the major accountancy companies, we will come to review their role as well, because they're advising these companies, signing off their audited books and all the rest, they're advising them on the avoidance schemes that they ensure minimises their tax contribution. And it's interesting, you know, it is interesting because it was interesting the response to that, because we'd had an Oxfam report earlier that week just about levels of global poverty as well. It's interesting because quite a number of people who I thought I'd get quite a rough ride, I didn't. Quite a number of people were coming up and saying, I think you're right. I want to live in a society where we do pay our way. And again, it was interesting how many now are going towards this tax mark where they're actually saying, look, we want to demonstrate that we're paying our way. I said that's fine. If you're a corporation that's making profits and you're paying your taxes, congratulations, well done, you're making your contribution. If you're a rich person and you're paying your taxes as like the rest of us, again, good, you're a citizen that we can congratulate for the role that they play within society. But we can't tolerate this level of tax evasion and tax avoidance. Finally, let me just say this. We've been working internationally on this across Europe too, and our MEPs have been working on this, but Tory MEPs have been vetoing regulations that have been coming through the European Parliament time after time after time. And again, what we want to do in our campaigning now is to expose their role in protecting tax evaders and tax avoiders. People have had enough. The Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, they've exposed the use of tax havens by these companies and rich individuals. And it's no wonder people get angry about that when they go to work long hours, pay their taxes, and then see these companies and individuals walking away and not shouldering their responsibility too. Thanks.
Barnet being Barnet, I work in council housing, and they make it incredibly difficult because we've got things like a local authority trading company owned by the London Borough of Barnet. We've got an Almo that still functions, owned by the London Borough of Barnet. What's Labour's policy when it comes to housing? What are we at? Can we go back to sort of local authorities building council houses?
In the manifesto, we put in the minimal need is for 1 million new homes. So we said that's what our target. That's what we're going to build. We said half of those will be council homes, and we'll be proud to call them council homes. Yeah. Proud to call them council homes again. We've said. My view, and it's a personal view, and it'll be up to the democratic decisions that get taken locally by local councillors and consultants with the community. I'd rather bring everything back in-house. We had Almos and all the rest of it in my constituency, and it was a disaster, to be honest. So I'd rather it was direct delivery, but that'll be part of the discussions that take place locally. And again, there'll be consultations over that. But we've generally found that where they're brought back in-house, at least you've got accountable management, rather than some arm's length. And what happened in my area, I don't know, you can tell me whether that happened here, they set up the Almo, and the top directors then got a massive salary increase. We saw no improvement in terms of the delivery of service, quite the reverse. And tenants were so angry, even a Tory council had to say this is enough, and brought them back. Here's the irony as well in my constituency, you tell me it's like here. I've got a Tory council now renting back council houses to house families that they sold off 20 years ago, and it's costing them a fortune, an absolute fortune. We want to end the sell-offs, build homes, build council homes in particular, allow local authorities to borrow to do that because they've got the resource to do it, and on that way we can actually accommodate people to a decent standard of living. We are looking as well about how do you do that on any scale. We're looking at modern forms of building as well. We're talking to Federation of Master Builders and others, and it's quite remarkable what's been done in other countries across Europe about, I was in a slum, we got moved into a prefab, then a council house. But the new ways of building, we think we can build in numbers. And I don't know if you saw in the paper a couple of weeks ago, John Heath, our housing spokesperson, said as well that we're not paying through the nose for land. We're not going to be in a situation where all of a sudden they give themselves planning permission and the price of the property goes up 10 or 15 times. We're going to pay for what the value is without that planning permission. And that will tackle some of the issues around land hoarding by some of these big conglomerates as well. Finally, let me just say this as well. We've said too that where in some cities where there's housing pressures, we think there's a role there if necessary to introduce some forms of rent controls as well, so you're linking that to the local wages too. Now I know that people think that's revolutionary. It used to happen here. We used to have fair rents where you, because of the housing pressures, you bring about fair rents, because it will take us time to build the homes. So in the meantime, those people in the private sector need protection in terms of security as well as rents. Finally.
Just answer John's comment about directors, and in the Barnet Group, our new chief executive is got awarded, well, I don't know if he awarded it himself, but someone awarded him a 15% pay rise over a 2-year period after the other guy left. And we have a whole plethora of management that nobody actually seems to know how much they're paid, even the local councillors, because I have been asking the question.
It's all about outsourcing and privatisation. Do it and you'll be causing mass devastation. So come on, do the easy council with me. How about we change the words to come on, stop the easy council with me.